Stop it already. You must have a lot of time on your hands. I know, it's you. Every day, someone calls me in silence. But that day, I had reached my limit and I started talking non-stop like a machine gun. However, as usual, the other person was silent. When I was about to give up and hang up, I heard a distinctive sound. It was the sound of our clockwork clock at home. It was faintly audible from the other end of the phone. If it was you, after all, the clock at home just rang. You're probably laughing with your mistress about me. Don't mess with me. I said, then hung up the phone forcefully, convinced that it was my husband. I told the children to come home right away. I had been escaping from reality, but I finally went home to comfort my husband. My name is Margaret. I'm a housewife who will be 65 soon. My husband Richard, who's a year older than me, and I have been happily aging together as we promised through thick and thin. We will soon celebrate our 43rd wedding anniversary. Richard was a quiet person who didn't express his opinions much. In contrast, I was talkative to the point of being called someone who talks incessantly, and it was always noisy. Richard would listen to me without complaining. He was a very kind person. The balance between our stillness and movement was just right, which was probably why we've been together for so long until this age. We had a son and a daughter, but they're already married and have left home. They had both found good partners, and we have grandchildren. Richard and I had nothing to worry about. But there was the thing I was worried about, which was my beloved mother, who was about to turn 93 and lived in the countryside. My father passed away in an accident when I was in my teens, and my mother, who did not remarry, worked hard to raise me and to go to college. I could never thank her enough, and I respected her so much. As an only child, I wanted to bring my mother here and to live with her. However, my mother would say, "I don't like the city because it's noisy. I prefer to live freely in the countryside." She'd been gently rejecting my offer to live with me whenever we talked on the phone. After our kids left home, I found every month to go to the countryside with her for a few days. Recently, my mother had started showing signs of dementia, so I made sure to go back at least once a month. However, considering the cost of transportation and my own physical strength, it was becoming increasingly difficult to do so. But my mother was still healthy for her age, which was a relief. However, one day my mother called me, which was unusual. "I'm really sorry, Margaret." My mother continued apologetically. Apparently, she had apologized while doing yard work and ended up tripping and breaking her hand. Luckily, it was her non-dominant left hand, so she could still carry on with her daily activities without any problems. She just wanted to let me know to make sure I wasn't too worried. After making sure she wasn't hurt anywhere else, I told her I would be coming home soon and hung up the phone. When I told Richard, who had just returned home, about my mother's broken hand, he immediately said, "That must be tough for her. Forget about me, why don't you go stay with her until at least the cast is taken off?" He was worried about my mother, and I thanked him many times. The next day, I made some freezer meals for him and packed my bag, and hurried to my mother's house. She was surprised to see me, but I could tell she was relieved. She had never broken a bone before, so she was probably a little anxious. When I told Richard's message to her, she teared up. "You married a really good man, Margaret. Please thank Richard for me when you get back." Overwhelmed with happiness, I smiled and nodded, and started taking care of my mother's daily needs. Before long, her cast was taken off, and even the doctor was surprised how quickly her bone had healed. My mother, who always bragged about her health and strong body, seemed to be right, and I was impressed by her resilience. I left her to the caregiver, whom I always asked regularly, and decided to go back home. At my home, after a long time, tiredness overwhelmed me all at once. Then Richard returned home. I lay down on the sofa to take a little nap. While having dinner with Richard, I talked about my mother, but I felt something was off. Richard's attitude was somewhat distant, which he had not done before. Even during the meal, he looked at his smartphone enthusiastically, and his mind seemed absent even when we talked. I thought he would never do such a thing as cheating, but I felt there was something strange about him. Still, I was more concerned about my mother. But even after several days, his strange behavior did not stop, but rather increased. He would go out without saying anything early in the morning and not come back until late at night. He said he was going on a business trip and would be gone for several days. And to top it up, he started saying, "Why don't you go back to your mother's? I'm worried about her." Gradually, the discomfort in me turned into distrust and continued to grow. That day, when I saw Richard trying to sneak out as usual, I panicked and called out to him, "Hold on, honey!" When I shouted like that, he turned around with a surprised expression. I couldn't bear the discomfort and distrust anymore. I approached Richard, who was standing frozen in surprise. "Hey, what's been going on lately? You don't even listen to me and you lock yourself in your room right away. You sneak out like this. Just stop being silent all the time. If there's something, tell me." Without giving him a chance to answer, I snapped at Richard like a machine gun. He looked at me in astonishment, but remained silent. So I also stayed silent and looked at him. Then Richard, who had been listening silently, sighed deeply, and he glared at me. "I've had enough. I can't take it anymore. Listen, Margaret, I have a mistress and I'm going to spend the rest of my life with her quietly. Please divorce me. A noisy, nagging woman like you is a nuisance." Richard said all of that to me at once and took out the divorce papers in his bag and thrust them at me. I was surprised, perplexed, and bewildered. All I could say was, "Huh?" With my mouth open, I alternately looked at the divorce papers with Richard, who was glaring at me. Then he spoke as if to release all of his pent-up frustration. "You are really noisy. Can you be quiet for a little bit? I come home tired every day from work and have to listen to your noise. You're more suited to taking care of the elderly in the countryside. Come on, sign here and go back to the countryside quickly." I could only look at Richard in disbelief. His outline was gradually trembling and blurring. "The noise? Elderly in the countryside? Is this what I get for being together with you for over 40 years? My voice was shaking, and the usual machine gun attack was not functioning at all. It turned out that Richard was appearing blurry, and because I was crying. With tears overflowing, I was gazing at him. He looked at me, seemed to be choked up, but quickly turned his face away. Then he took out a pen out of his bag and said, "Margaret, sign this." Richard spoke in a cold voice, but I could no longer stand, and broke down in tears. We've been together for over 40 years, and it's the first time I've heard his voice like that, causing me to burst into tears. Perhaps he didn't want to give me any opportunity to think, so he handed me the pen and urged me to sign the divorce papers. I no longer had any energy in me left to resist. As instructed, I signed the papers, and Richard quietly snatched the divorce papers away from me, then left the house, ignoring my crying. I crouched down for a while, before slowly standing up, and I packed the essentials before leaving the house I'd lived in for over 40 years. I'd never dreamed that life with Richard would end like this. I never doubted that we would grow old together. I almost started crying again, but I gritted my teeth. I just want to see my mother in the countryside as soon as possible. She was surprised to see me arrive without any notice, but she must have sensed something different about me. Without saying anything, she made me a cup of hot tea, which warmed my chilled body, and I felt comforted by my mother's kind gaze. Tears flowed from my eyes again, and through my sobs, I told her that Richard had asked for a divorce, that I had signed the papers, and that I had been kicked out of the house. My mother nodded and listened intently. Her wrinkled hand rested on mine, and she said, "Margaret, you must be exhausted. Rest for a while. If the weather is nice tonight, we can go pick up some apples in the mountains, like the old times. You love those apples. Let's get plenty." Overwhelmed by my mother's kindness, I cried out and hugged her. Despite her body being smaller when I was a child, her immense was as strong as it ever was. At that time, the old-fashioned phone in my mother's house rang. Instead of me, who stiffened at the sudden sound, my mother answered the phone unsteadily, but it seemed to have been cut off. I was surprised at myself for expecting that it was a call from Richard, asking me to come back. I held my breath and stared at the phone, but then saw my mother coming back unsteadily. It occurred to me that I could be taking care of my mother without worrying about anything else. After all, I had been taking care of someone else's needs all this time, and maybe it was the first time God had given me the focus to just do it on one person. With that thought, I nodded to myself several times. Fortunately, my mother had her pension, and we were not struggling financially. I knew I needed to talk to Richard eventually, but it was impossible at the moment. We both decided to calm down a bit, so I decided to escape reality for a while and contact my kids when things settled down. The next day, my life in the countryside started. A few days after living in the countryside, I realized that there was a big difference between having a home to return to occasionally, visiting here, and actually living. The old wooden house was so drafty, and it was always cold, and the mice had chewed it here and there. They ran around loudly in the ceiling at night, making me sleepless. And every day I screamed at the sight of bugs that I had never seen before. This was a common occurrence in rural life, and it drained my energy completely. In addition, perhaps my mother also felt relieved that I had come home, or because I had not been trying to face the reality until now. It seems that her dementia had progressed more than I had thought. She would always ask me the same thing, repeatedly throughout the day. She watched TV at a high volume. My stamina was always being depleted, and on top of that, the boiler was old and it was difficult for me to get hot water. If I had been on vacation, I would have gone to a spa or eaten out. Using as little hot water as possible and not doing much housework, but when it came to everyday life, it couldn't be helped. Doing housework with ice-cold water was normal, and it was a struggle just to go grocery shopping. With only vegetables grown in the garden, we couldn't eat well, and I was feeling more and more miserable. I was losing weight rapidly, and I had just reached my body's limits both physically and mentally. Something happened that was like a final blow. Ring, ring. Once again, the phone was ringing today. Silent calls have become more or almost a daily occurrence, but this was the 5th time just for today. The cause of my weight loss was not only due to the hardships of living in the countryside and taking care of my mother, but also due to these silent calls. I yelled towards my mother in the living room, "Mom, I'm doing the dishes, so can you please answer the phone?" Finally, responding to my repeated calls, she slowly got up to walk unsteadily, then answered the phone. But as usual, it was silent and hung up after a while. No matter what my mother or I said, the calls were always silent and hung up, but it was a cycle that made me nervous and irritated every time. I was so angry that I suggested we replace the phone with the latest model to prevent pranks, but she just shook her head. "The phone is enough for me, and I don't have much time left, so it would be wasted to buy a new one. Besides, I wouldn't even know how to use a new one. Margaret, if you worry about that, they'll get tired and eventually stop calling." She didn't seem to mind much because she's hard of hearing, but I still wasn't used to it, so I was nervous every time. I was convinced that this silent phone call was definitely Richard's harassment. Does he hate me and my mother that much? I hated the joy of taking care of my beloved mother. It was turning into frustration. What was my married life like to be treated like this? Thinking of that made me feel pathetic and frustrated and mentally cornered. One day, as usual, the phone rang loudly. I gathered my courage and picked up the phone, then yelled to the person on the other end, "Stop it already. You must have a lot of time on your hands. I know it's you." Lately, I'd been answering the phone on purpose and fighting back, speaking nonstop like a machine gun. But, as usual, the other person remained silent. Just when I was about to give up and hang up the phone, I heard a distinctive sound. It was the sound of our clock at home. It was faintly audible from the other side of the phone. "It was you, after all. The clock at home just rang. You're probably laughing with your mistress about me. Don't mess with me," I said, then hung up the phone forcefully, convinced that it was Richard. I immediately told my kids that I had divorced their father and asked them to come to my house. I had been, in reality, avoiding it, but Now I was going to face it and confront Richard. I headed towards my home, ready for battle, and opened up the front door in combat mode. I went straight to the living room, but Richard was nowhere to be seen, and I was taken aback. Worried that he had escaped, I checked each room one at a time. When I opened the bedroom door, I saw a blanket with someone underneath it. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I thought he was with his lover, so I pulled the covers off with all my might. Then there was Richard, lying thin, emaced. He smiled at me happily and said, "Margaret, welcome back. I'm sorry." I was so surprised that I couldn't find any words. In fact, Richard had been given a terminal diagnosis. The treatment, which was expensive and uncertain, would have taken up a lot of time and effort, so he'd be struggling alone and decided not to undergo it. He had been going out secretly just to go to the hospital. He knew that if he had told me he was sick, I would have tried harder, so he had deliberately given me a divorce ultimatum and asked me to focus on taking care of my beloved mother instead. It was Richard's almost consideration for me, who was already struggling with my mother's care. But he became lonely, and when he was alone, he just wanted to hear my voice, so he kept making those silent phone calls. "Why don't you ever tell me important things?" I asked, holding Richard's thin hand and crying. "Because you're better at talking, so I leave it to you. That's how we've spent our time together, right?" Richard said with an awkward wink and smiled peacefully. "Margaret, I thought I had prepared myself for a lot of things, but it's weird. I couldn't submit the divorce papers." Richard whispered, and I said to him, "That's only natural. After all, you love me, don't you?" After that, we discussed the future plans with our kids. We decided to never sell the house and use the money for Richard's treatment. Our eldest son and wife offered to live with us, and the remaining money in their help, but we had built a 2-family house with our son taking on a mortgage. We also invited my mother, with the help of our daughter-in-law and a caregiver. I now take care of Richard and my mother. Fortunately, Richard's treatment has become quite surprisingly effective, and his life expectancy has been revised by a doctor's appointment. On our way back home from the hospital, he smiled at me and said, "I guess we can overcome anything if we work together as a family instead of struggling alone." I nodded and said, "Yes, that's right. You may be a man of few words, but please always tell me important things from now on. We are a couple, after all." Hearing that, Richard narrowed his eyes and smiled.